The land in hill country does not ask for your opinion. It does not care about your spreadsheets or your quarterly projections or the number printed at the bottom of a bank statement. It has its own arithmetic, written in caliche and cedar root, and the way thunderstorms move through the draws in late July. Caleb Mercer had understood this since he was 9 years old, walking behind his father through rows of winter wheat, learning to read the color of the sky the way other boys learn to read books. He had spent 46 years on that understanding. He had staked his life on it, and on a Tuesday morning in August, sitting in a glass-walled office that smelled like carpet cleaner and cold air, he was being told that his understanding was worth nothing at all. Preston Holt sat behind a mahogany desk that was wider than most dining room tables. He was 38 years old, with the kind of posture that comes from never having carried anything heavier than a leather briefcase. His suit was charcoal gray, fitted at the shoulders, and his cufflinks caught the light when he moved. He had a tablet on the desk in front of him, and he looked at it the way a man looks at something he has already decided about. He did not look at Caleb. "The numbers are not working in your favor," Preston said. 3 consecutive quarters of net loss. Soybean yields down 37%. Your winter wheat came in at less than half of projected, and you are sitting here asking me to approve $210,000 for additional equipment. It is not additional." Caleb said. His voice was quiet. It was always quiet. It is the only equipment that can fix what is happening out there. Preston set the tablet down and folded his hands. He had a way of listening that was not really listening. It was the practiced stillness of a man waiting for the other person to finish so he could say what he had already planned to say. "There is an invasive species on my south and east fields," Caleb continued. "We call it scarlet root, red-stemmed, thick stalks, taproot that goes down 4 feet into the hard pan. My current equipment cannot break that layer. The John Deere 9R with a deep ripper attachment is the only machine rated for that penetration depth. If I do not turn that soil over before the end of September, the infestation is going to take the remaining acreage, all of it." Preston opened a slim manila folder. He slid a single sheet of paper across the desk without ceremony. The paper was heavy, watermarked, and it had Caleb's name printed at the top. "The trust cannot approve this request," Preston said. "And given the current delinquency on your primary mortgage, we are legally obligated to move your account into mitigation phase. That is a notice of intent to foreclose. You have 90 days to satisfy the outstanding balance or the bank will proceed with asset seizure." Caleb looked at the paper. He didn't pick it up. He read it where it sat on the desk, and the words arranged themselves in his mind the way the words of a bad diagnosis arrange themselves. You understand each one individually. It takes a moment for them to mean what they mean together. He thought about his grandfather Jonas clearing the original 60 acres with a borrowed dozer and a chainsaw, and more stubbornness than sense. He thought about his father dying in the shadow of the main equipment shed. The heart attack coming on a Wednesday afternoon in October. The ambulance taking 40 minutes to reach them because of where they were. He thought about himself at 19. Standing at the edge of those same fields and making the silent decision that he was staying. That no matter what, he was staying. 90 days, Caleb said. Preston was already looking at his computer screen. "I suggest you begin contacting auction houses about your remaining equipment inventory. Have a good afternoon, Mr. Mercer." The drive back from Kerrville took 40 minutes on a state road that cut through cedar and live oak and the pale limestone outcroppings that gave hill country its particular character. Caleb drove with both hands on the wheel of his truck, a 2004 Ford F250 with a cracked dashboard and 160,000 miles on it. The radio was off. He did not need sound. What he needed was the road and the time and the slow process of letting something terrible become real. He had known something was wrong the previous September when the bank sent a courier rather than a letter. The man had arrived at the tailgate of the truck while Caleb was unloading late sorghum in the afternoon heat, a clipboard in one hand and a pen already uncapped in the other. "Just a renewal of your mitigation terms," the courier had said. "Standard administrative update. Nothing material has changed." Caleb had signed on the hood of the truck without going inside, without sitting down, without reading past the first paragraph. He had been too tired and too busy, and he had trusted that a routine update was what it said it was. That trust, he now understood, was the most expensive thing he had ever given away for free. When he pulled into the gravel drive of the Mercer farm, His wife Della was on the porch, shelling black-eyed peas into a metal bowl. She looked up when she heard the truck. She set the bowl down on the wooden chair beside her and walked down the steps. She didn't ask how it went. The angle of Caleb's shoulders when he stepped out of the truck had already told her. He said it standing at the front of the truck with his hand still on the hood. 90 days. Then they take the land. Della stood very still. She was 52 years old, built lean from a lifetime of work, with gray beginning at her temples that she had never bothered to address. She had grown up on a cattle operation in Uvalde County. She understood what land meant to a man. She understood what losing it meant. She looked out past Caleb toward the south fields. From where they stood, the damage was visible from 300 yards. Where there should have been late-season sorghum, there was a rolling carpet of dark red. It moved slightly in the afternoon heat, the thick serrated leaves catching the wind, and from a distance it looked almost beautiful, the way certain disasters do. The scarlet root had appeared in March, 2 weeks after the worst flash flood hill country had seen in 30 years. It had come up through the wet soil like something that had been waiting, something that knew exactly where it was going. By April, it had taken 30 acres on the south side. By June, it had crossed the dry creek bed and spread through the east fields as well. The root structure drove 4 feet down into the hardpan calyx layer. And when Caleb had tried to pull one plant by hand, he had understood immediately that his equipment was not built for this fight. The stalk came up 18 inches and then snapped. What remained underground sent up 3 new stems within 2 weeks. He had tried herbicide in April. The scarlet root absorbed it and kept growing. He had tried a neighbor's older ripper attachment in May and bent 2 tines on the first pass. By July, he had accepted that the only answer was the right machine and the right depth and the right timing. And he had gone to the bank for the money to make that happen. Now the bank had given him a piece of watermarked paper instead. Caleb walked to the machine shed and stood inside it in the dark for a long time. The shed smelled like grease and old rubber and the metallic dryness of a West Texas summer. His grandfather's tools hung on pegboard along the east wall, organized by Jonas Mercer in 1962 and never moved. A ball-peen hammer, a set of open-end wrenches, a pry bar with a wrapped handle that Caleb had used himself 10,000 times. He stood and looked at those tools and tried to find something in them that would tell him what to do. He did not find it. What he found instead, late that afternoon, was the thing he had been avoiding for 3 weeks. He walked out to the south field with a machete and a rusted burn barrel he dragged from behind the shed. He started cutting. He was not calm about it. He cut the way a man cuts when he has used up his patience and his strategy and his careful thinking, and what is left is just the animal need to do something with his hands. He hacked at the thick red stems and the plants resisted him, rooted and stubborn, and he pulled great armfuls of the torn vegetation and threw them into the barrel. Della stood at the field's edge. She did not try to stop him. She knew what this was. She had seen her own father do something similar the year the drought took his second hay crop, and there was nothing left to do but destroy something, so the grief had somewhere to go. Caleb doused the pile with 2 inches of gasoline from a red can and threw in a lit match. The fire caught with a sound like a held breath suddenly released. Black smoke rolled up into the late afternoon sky. He dropped to one knee in the dirt and put his face in his hands and let the months of sleeplessness and worry and the humiliation of sitting across from Preston Holt's folded hands come through him all at once. He stayed that way for a long time. Then the smell changed. The gasoline burned off fast and chemical and harsh, the way it always does. But underneath it, rising from the burning mass of red stems and thick leaves, there was something else entirely. Something that did not belong in a Texas field on a Tuesday afternoon. Caleb raised his head. He frowned. He sniffed the air the way a man sniffs when he does not trust what his nose is telling him. It was butter. Not the cheap kind. The brown kind. The kind that comes from a pan that has been too hot for just long enough. And underneath that, something earthier. Something that reminded him of the one time Della had taken him to a restaurant in San Antonio for their anniversary. The kind of restaurant where the menus had no prices and the waiter explained each dish as if telling a story. There had been something in the pasta that night that tasted like the ground itself. Like rain on warm soil distilled into something a person could eat. The chef had called it truffle. Caleb had nodded politely and not entirely understood. He understood now. He stood and walked to the barrel. He reached in and pulled a half-burned stalk from the edge of the pile, where the heat had blistered the crimson skin and caused a thick amber sap to bead along the surface. He stood there with the charred plant in his hand and looked at it for a long moment. Then, because he was a man who had spent his life making decisions based on direct evidence rather than other people's opinions, he pressed his thumb to the cooling sap and touched it to his tongue. His eyes went still, not wide, still, the way a man's eyes go when something very precise is happening behind them. The flavor hit first as citrus, clean and bright, like the inside of a Meyer lemon in early morning. Then it folded into something much deeper, something that had weight and darkness to it, like aged cheese and wood smoke, and the richness of something that had been underground for a very long time. Then a warmth at the back of the throat that stayed. Caleb stood in the dirt with a burned weed in his hand and experienced something he had not felt in 4 months, something that resembled hope, though he did not yet name it that. "Della," he said. She came to him. He held out the stalk. She looked at it. Then she looked at him. "Caleb Mercer, I am not eating a weed you just poured gasoline on. Just the leaf, from the edge, please." She took a breath. She broke a small, unburned leaf from the outer edge of the stalk, one that had only been touched by the radiant heat at the barrel's rim, and she put it in her mouth. She chewed once. She stopped. Her hand went to her lips. "Caleb," she said, very quietly, "that tastes like the restaurant, the one in San Antonio." He nodded. He looked out at the 200 acres of red-covered fields. He looked at them the way you look at something when its meaning has just fundamentally shifted. The problem was still the same. The infestation was still there. The bank notice was still folded in his shirt pocket. But the thing growing in his fields was not what he had thought it was. And that difference, whatever it meant, was the first thing in 4 months that felt like ground under his feet. He did not sleep that night. He sat at the kitchen table with his grandfather's field notebooks stacked in front of him. There were 11 of them. Going back to 1947, each one filled with Jonas Mercer's cramped and deliberate handwriting. Caleb had not read them in years. He had never needed to. But he was looking now for something specific, a reference, a note, anything his grandfather might have written about a red-stemmed plant with a flavor that did not belong in a Texas field. He found it in the 6th notebook, in an entry dated September 1951. "The red weed has come back after the late summer flooding. 3rd time in my experience. It takes the bottomland first, then moves uphill as the soil dries. The root goes deep, deeper than anything I have tried to pull. Do not attempt to eradicate completely. Whatever is in the soil that feeds this plant is also what makes this land what it is. Leave the root system. Harvest the top growth only if you must. The land that feeds this plant will pay you back in kind. That is not sentiment. That is 40 years of watching." Caleb read the entry 3 times. He turned the page. There was a small notation at the bottom of the next page, written in a different ink, added at some later date. Asked a man in Fredericksburg about it once. He had seen something similar in Europe. Said the flavor came from what the root was doing underground. Said in France they would have charged $50 a pound for it. I did not believe him at the time. Caleb closed the notebook and sat in the kitchen with the clock ticking on the wall and the sound of Della's breathing from the bedroom and the silence of a Texas night pressing against the windows. He went to bed at 2 in the morning. He lay on his back and stared at the ceiling. Della turned toward him in her sleep and put her hand on his arm without waking. He listened to her breathe and thought about his grandfather's handwriting and the smell of something burning that should not have smelled the way it did. And slowly, in the dark, a shape began to form in his mind that was not yet a plan, but was the beginning of one. The following Saturday, Della was behind the wheel of the F250 by 4 in the morning. She had been the one to propose it. Caleb had been skeptical. She had not asked for his opinion on the matter. She had filled 4 large coolers with harvested scarlet root, cut the night before, packed in ice, stems trimmed to 6 inches and bundled with baling twine. She had made a sign on cardboard with a black marker. It said, "Wild Herb, $4 a bundle," and she had added, after a moment of consideration, rich truffle flavor at the bottom, which Caleb had looked at without expression. The Austin Farmers Market was already crowded by the time they arrived and set up. The booth spaces around them held the kind of vendors that now populated these markets, a young woman selling lavender lemonade in mason jars, a man with a carefully designed logo offering small batch hot sauce, an operation with matching aprons and a chalkboard menu and a hand-lettered story about their regenerative farm. Caleb and Della had a folding table, 4 coolers, and a cardboard sign. By noon, they had sold nothing. The scarlet root looked wrong to people. That was the simple truth. The deep red coloring, the thick serrated leaves, the slight iridescence on the cut stems. It looked like something you would photograph and look up online before touching. Several people paused, leaned in, and moved on. One man said something to the woman beside him, and they both laughed quietly. Another took a photograph, and Caleb watched him type something before he put his phone away. He found out later what the man had posted in the Hill Country Farmers Network group on Facebook. A photo of the Mercer booth with the caption, "Somebody is selling a known invasive species at the Austin market. Either desperate or crazy. Take your pick." Fletcher Briggs saw that post within 20 minutes of it going up. Fletcher farmed the 230 acres directly north of the Mercer property. He was 58 years old, with a gray beard kept short and a way of standing with his thumbs in his pockets that made him look like he was waiting for something to go wrong so he could say he had seen it coming. He had been Caleb's neighbor for 22 years and his friend, or something close enough to it, for most of that time. He had borrowed Caleb's equipment when his own broke down. He had helped string fence after the ice storm of 2017. He had stood next to Caleb in the hospital waiting room the day Caleb's father collapsed. He had also, 7 months earlier, hired a botanical consultant from San Marcos to conduct a soil and vegetation survey of the watershed that crossed both their properties. The consultant had identified the scarlet root. He had given Fletcher a 3-page report. He had told Fletcher, carefully and precisely, what he believed the plant was and what he believed it was worth. Fletcher had a problem. The scarlet root grew on Mercer land, not his. The soil composition on the south-facing draws of the Mercer property, the caliche depth and the mineral content and the underground hydrology running below the old creek bed. Those conditions did not exist on his side of the fence line. He had walked the boundary. He had checked. The plant did not cross into his acreage, which meant the only way Fletcher Briggs was going to benefit from what grew on Caleb Mercer's land was if that land stopped being Caleb Mercer's land. He had made a phone call to Preston Holt 8 months ago. It had been a short conversation. Preston had been interested. Preston was always interested in things that could be acquired cheaply from people who did not yet know what they had. At the Austin market, at 12:43 in the afternoon, Caleb was beginning to pile the unsold bundles back into the cooler when a man appeared on the other side of the table. He was in his mid-30s, wearing dark trousers and a plain white shirt, with a leather notebook under his arm and the focused look of someone who is always searching for something specific. His name was Nate Gallagher. He had been working as an ingredient scout for a regional restaurant group for 6 years. He had spent 3 of those years tracking down a description that appeared in a food science journal from 2019. A single paragraph written by a researcher who had encountered an unclassified Oculus variant and described the flavor profile in language that had stayed with Nate through several hundred farmers markets and 3 states. The samples the researcher had studied had sat in a university archive for over 2 decades before the researcher returned to them as part of a broader study on regional soil-plant interactions. The paper had taken that long because no one had known to look for it sooner. Nate had been told he was searching for something that might not exist outside a controlled collection. He had kept looking anyway. He stopped in front of Caleb's table. He did not look at the sign. He was looking at the plant. He leaned forward and breathed in from 6 inches above the nearest bundle. He straightened up and looked at Caleb. "Where does this come from?" he said. "My farm," Caleb said. "Hill County, about 60 miles west. Is this everything you have? I have 200 acres of it." Nate looked at Caleb the way a man looks at another man when he is deciding whether to believe something almost too good to be real. Then he reached out and picked a single small leaf from the bundle nearest to him. He held it for a moment, looking at it. Then he put it in his mouth. He was still for 8 seconds. Caleb counted. "What do you call this?" Nate said. "Scarlet root," Caleb said. "It is destroying my soybean crop." Nate reached into the pocket of his trousers and found his wallet. He took out 4 $100 bills and set them on the table. He said, "I'm taking what you have here today, and I need your phone number, and I need you to not sell a single stem of this to anyone else until you hear from me. What you are calling a weed is something I have been looking for 3 years." His voice dropped slightly. "Sir, I cannot yet promise you a specific number, but if the chef I work with responds the way I think he will respond, you're going to need to stop worrying about that bank notice in your pocket." Caleb had not mentioned the bank notice. He had not mentioned the bank at all. He looked at the $400 bills on the folding table. He looked at this young man with his leather notebook and his plain white shirt. He thought about his grandfather's handwriting. The land that feeds this plant will pay you back in kind. That is not sentiment. That is 40 years of watching. He gave Nate Gallagher his phone number. On the drive home, Della said nothing for the first 20 miles. Then she said, "Do you believe him?" Caleb thought about it for a moment. "I believe the flavor," he said. "I believe what it tastes like. Whether this man can do anything with that, I do not know yet." Della nodded. She drove. Outside the window, the hill country moved past in the late afternoon light. Cedar and limestone and the long, pale grass that survived everything because it had learned to survive everything. "I want you to go see Earl Donovan tomorrow," she said. Caleb looked at her. "He has been trying to reach you for 2 weeks," she said. "He left a message with your sister when you would not answer your phone. He said he has something that belongs to you." Earl Donovan lived on 12 remaining acres at the end of a county road that used to lead to his family's full operation before the bank had finished with it. That had been 4 years ago. The process had taken 11 months and had ended with Earl signing over 240 acres of rangeland in exchange for the bank forgiving a debt that Earl's own accountant had later told him was being miscalculated in the bank's favor. Earl had not had the money to fight it in court. He had not had the money for much of anything afterwards. He was 73 years old, built like a fence post, with hands that had not recovered their full steadiness since the stress of the foreclosure. He met Caleb at the gate of his remaining property, and they walked together to the small house without saying much, because they were men who did not need to fill silence to be comfortable in it. Inside, on the kitchen table, was a cardboard box sealed with decades of careful storage, and inside the box, wrapped in an old flour sack, was a notebook. Not the field notebooks Caleb had read the night before. This was different. Smaller, with a dark green cover and the initials J.M. pressed into the front. Earl set it on the table between them. "Your grandfather gave this to my father in 1962, Earl said. "Jonas and my dad were close. They farmed adjacent land for 30 years, your side and ours. And Jonas trusted my father the way men trust each other when they have carried hard things together. When Jonas got sick, he gave my father this notebook specifically. He said it was not for his son yet. He said to hold it until there was a reason." Caleb looked at the notebook. He did not touch it yet. "My father held it," Earl said. "Then I held it. 4 years ago, when the bank took my land, I thought about your grandfather and wondered if that was the reason. But then you seemed to be managing. I did not know how to bring it up. Then last spring, when the flooding came and I heard about what was happening on your south fields, I thought, that might be it. That might be what Jonas meant." Caleb picked up the notebook. He opened it. The handwriting inside was his grandfather's, the same cramped and deliberate hand from the field notebooks, but different in character. These were not farm records. These were observations, thinking on paper, the kind of writing a man does when he is trying to understand something, rather than simply document it. He turned to the last page. There was a single paragraph, written in a hand slightly different from the others. The pen pressed harder into the paper as if the writer had been older, or more certain, or both. "To whoever finds this land worth fighting for, the red plant that comes after the flooding is not a curse. I spent 12 years believing it was, and 12 more years understanding what it actually is. The soil on the South Draws is different from anything else in this county. Whatever is down there, under the caliche, feeds that plant, and the plant carries it up into the world in a form that has value, real value. I'm not a man who uses words loosely. Do not be in a hurry to destroy what you do not yet understand. The land that raised this family has one more thing to give. Wait for the right moment, then hold on." Caleb closed the notebook. He held it in both hands and sat in Earl Donovan's kitchen in the quiet of a hill country morning and let his grandfather's words settle into him the way water settles into dry ground. Slowly, completely. He thought about the $400 on the folding table. He thought about Nate Gallagher's 8 seconds of stillness. He thought about the smell of something burning in a field at dusk that should not have smelled like anything worth keeping. He stood up. He thanked Earl. He shook the older man's hand and held it a moment longer than a handshake strictly requires. Then he drove home, and when he got there, his phone was ringing, and the number on the screen was Nate Gallagher's. And when he answered, the first thing Nate said was, "The chef wants to meet you. He wants to see the fields." And if this plant is what I believe it is, he does not care what the asking price is. Caleb stood in the driveway with his grandfather's notebook under his arm and listened to those words and said nothing for a moment. Then he said, "Tell him to come Thursday." He ended the call. He looked out at the south fields, 200 acres of dark red burning in the afternoon sun. He went inside to tell Della. Thursday came in hot and cloudless, the kind of August morning in hill country where the air has already given up on being cool before the sun clears the ridge. Caleb was in the equipment shed by 5, checking the hydraulic lines on the old ripper attachment he kept for lighter work, not because he planned to use it, but because his hands needed something to do while he waited. Della made coffee and left a cup on the workbench without a word. She had a way of understanding what kind of morning it was. Nate Gallagher arrived at 8 in a white pickup that still had dealer plates. Behind him, in a black SUV with tinted glass, came Raymond Cross. Chef Raymond Cross was 57 years old and built like a man who had spent 3 decades standing over open flame. He was not tall, but he occupied space the way confident men do, completely and without apology. He had 2 James Beard Awards and a reputation in the Houston restaurant world for being exactly as difficult as his food was extraordinary. He wore kitchen whites even outside the kitchen, as if changing into civilian clothes was a concession he had not yet found worth making. He stepped out of the SUV and looked at the fields without speaking for a long moment. Then he looked at Caleb. "Show me," he said. They walked the south draws together, though Della stayed a half step behind and Nate stayed a half step behind her, understanding instinctively that this conversation belonged to the farmer and the chef. Cross walked into the edge of the scarlet root and crouched down, examining a stem from 6 inches away. He touched a leaf with 2 fingers. He pressed the stalk and watched the amber sap bead at the break point. He stood up. "You've been burning it," he said. "Not a question." "Some," Caleb said. Cross nodded slowly. "The burning breaks down the cell wall and releases the compound. Raw, it is interesting. Cooked, it is something else entirely." He looked out across the 200 acres of red. The Alba truffle harvest in Italy this year was almost nothing. Blight took 60% of the crop by June. What made it to market went for 3 times the usual price, and there was not enough of it at any price. Every serious kitchen in Texas and the Gulf Coast is trying to solve that problem right now, and none of them have. Cross paused. "What you have growing here is not a truffle. It is not botanically related to a truffle. But the flavor compound it produces when the root system interacts with this specific soil chemistry is, and I want to be precise, functionally identical to what truffle does in a finished dish. In some respects, it is more stable, more versatile." He turned and looked at Caleb directly. "I want an exclusive supply agreement. I want everything your land produces this season and an option on next season. I will pay $400 an ounce for prime cuts and $250 for secondary yield. I need the first delivery of 80 pounds within 5 days." Caleb did the arithmetic in his head. He had done it a dozen times since Nate's phone call, but he did it again now because he was a man who checked his numbers twice. $400 an ounce was $6,400 a pound. 80 pounds was more than $500,000 for a first delivery alone. He had 180 acres still actively producing scarlet root. "I can have 80 pounds to you in 5 days, Caleb said. Cross extended his hand. Caleb shook it. The grip was dry and firm and brief, the handshake of a man who makes decisions and moves on. That afternoon, Nate drove back to Houston to begin the paperwork. A commercial food lab in Austin that Nate used regularly for ingredient certification was already processing the samples he had sent Saturday. Rush turnaround was 48 hours. The certification would confirm the plant's classification as a naturally occurring oxalis variant, legal for commercial sale, no quarantine restrictions. Nate had learned early in his career to solve the paperwork problem before the money problem, because the paperwork problem always arrived first. Caleb and Della began harvesting that evening when the temperature dropped below 90. They worked by the light of battery-powered headlamps, cutting stems at the base, leaving the root system intact the way Jonas Mercer had written to do 70 years ago. The plants were thick and heavy with summer growth, and the sap ran freely at each cut, filling the air with the butter and earth smell that had started all of this. They worked without talking much. The work was the thing. By the second night, they had 60 pounds in temperature-controlled coolers. By the fourth morning, they had 93. The wire transfer confirmation arrived from the restaurant group on a Friday evening. Caleb was sitting at the kitchen table when his phone lit up with the notification. He read the number. He set the phone down. He picked it up and read it again. $120,000. Advance payment against the first delivery. Good faith retainer per the supply agreement terms. Della was at the sink. She heard the sound he made, which was not quite a word. She turned around. He held the phone up so she could read the screen. She wiped her hands on a dish towel very slowly. She pulled out the chair across from him and sat down. They looked at each other across the kitchen table in the silence of people who have been afraid for a long time and have just been given a reason to stop. That silence lasted about 14 hours. Saturday morning arrived with a vehicle Caleb did not recognize turning into his driveway before 8. A dark blue sedan, new model, followed by a white truck with a county seal on the door. Caleb watched from the kitchen window as Preston Holt stepped out of the sedan, jacket buttoned, moving with the deliberate composure of a man who had rehearsed this arrival. The man with the clipboard who stepped out of the county truck wore a lanyard and an expression of professional neutrality. Caleb went to the front door and opened it before they reached the porch. "Morning, Caleb," Preston said, his voice carrying the same measured certainty he had used across the mahogany desk 4 days earlier. Caleb waited. "I see you have had some recent activity in your account," Preston continued, "a significant wire transfer from a Houston-based corporate entity. The bank's monitoring system flags accounts in mitigation phase when incoming transactions exceed a certain threshold." He climbed the first porch step and stopped there, which put him at eye level with Caleb, a positioning that struck Caleb as deliberate. "Here is the situation," Preston said. "When we issued the notice of intent, the mitigation clause attached a provisional interest to all assets generated by the mortgaged property. That includes agricultural products, harvested or unharvested. The bank has a legal stake in the revenue from this crop until the outstanding debt is satisfied in full. And given the apparent value of what you are growing here, we believe the appropriate action is to accelerate the foreclosure timeline. The court date has been moved to 48 hours from now. At that point, the bank will take possession of the property and the standing crop." He said all of this evenly, without heat, as if describing a mechanical process rather than dismantling a man's life. "You gave us 90 days, Caleb said. "The mitigation agreement contains a provision for acceleration upon discovery of undisclosed high-value agricultural assets. I understand that language may not have been immediately clear when you signed the renewal last September." Caleb looked at Preston. He thought about September. He thought about a courier with a pen already uncapped and a document described as nothing more than a routine administrative update, and his own hand signing on the hood of the truck while his mind was still in the sorghum field. He understood now with complete clarity that the courier, the timing, the description, none of it had been routine. 48 hours, Caleb said. Preston nodded. "I suggest you contact legal counsel." He turned and walked back to the sedan. Caleb stood on the porch and watched the car back out of the driveway and disappear into the cedar brakes. He stood there a moment after the dust settled. Then he went inside and called Nate. The conversation was short. Caleb laid out the situation without commentary, the way he described everything, and Nate was quiet on the other end for long enough that Caleb thought the call had dropped. Then Nate said, "How long did they give you? 48 hours? Another pause. Do not agree to anything and do not let anyone onto the property without your lawyer present. Do you have a lawyer?" "My neighbor's son practices in Careville. Call him right now. I will call you back in 2 hours." Caleb ended the call. He looked at Della, who had heard enough to understand the shape of it. She sat down at the kitchen table and folded her hands in front of her. She was quiet for a moment. Then she looked up. "My father used to run cattle auctions," she said. "Not the kind with a building and a ring, the kind where you call everyone you know and you put the animals in the pasture and you let people bid on what they can see in front of them. He always said the worst thing you can do when someone is trying to force your hand is sell to just one buyer. The best thing you can do is make every buyer believe they might lose it to someone else." Caleb looked at her. "We have 80 pounds of product already certified and cooled," she said. "We have a standing crop of nearly 200 acres. Raymond Cross is not the only chef in Texas who has a truffle problem this season. He is just the first one who came to our field." Caleb was quiet. "You call Nate," she said. "You tell him we are tearing up the exclusive and we are holding an open harvest auction right here on this property. Invite every serious restaurant buyer in Texas and Louisiana you can reach in 48 hours. Cash or certified funds only. If Cross wants the supply, he can bid for it like everyone else. That was her decision. She had arrived at it before Preston's sedan had cleared the county road, and she was stating it now as a fact rather than a proposal. Caleb looked at his wife across the table. In 31 years of marriage, she had been right about enough things that he had learned to recognize the quality of certainty in her voice when it mattered. He picked up his phone and called Nate back. What Nate said when Caleb laid out the plan was a short, sharp sound somewhere between a laugh and a breath. Then he said, "Cross is going to be furious." "Yes," Caleb said. "He will come anyway. I expect he will. I will start making calls," Nate said. The next 36 hours moved the way time moves when there is too much to do and not enough of it. Caleb's lawyer, a quiet man named Dale who had handled agricultural contracts in Kerrville for 20 years, drove out to the farm Saturday afternoon and spent 3 hours going through the bank documents with a yellow highlighter and a legal pad. He confirmed what Caleb had suspected. The acceleration clause Preston had cited did not appear in the original loan agreement signed 4 years earlier. It appeared only in the one-page renewal Caleb had signed on the hood of his truck in September, the document the bank had described as a routine administrative update. Dale looked at Caleb over the top of his reading glasses. He said, "This is not standard agricultural lending practice. This clause was drafted specifically to capture exactly this kind of situation. Someone at that bank anticipated what might be on your land before you did." Caleb thought about Fletcher Briggs. He thought about a phone call made 8 months ago and a botanical consultant from San Marcos, and the way Fletcher's face had moved for just a moment at the Austin market before the laugh came out. He said, "What do I do about the 48-hour timeline?" Dale said, "You get your money together and you pay the debt before the court date. If you pay the full outstanding balance, the acceleration clause becomes moot. The bank cannot seize an asset when the underlying debt is already satisfied. How much total?" Dale looked at his notes, with penalties and the accelerated interest, $387,000. By Sunday evening. Caleb nodded. He walked Dale to his truck and thanked him and watched him drive away, and then went to find Della, who was on the phone in the kitchen organizing cooler logistics with a supplier in San Marcos who could deliver food-grade insulated transport units by the following morning. That night, Fletcher Briggs made a phone call. He had been watching the activity at the Mercer farm from his own property, the unfamiliar vehicles coming and going, the lights burning past midnight in the equipment shed, Della hauling coolers with the focused efficiency of someone executing a plan. He did not know the full details, but he knew enough to understand that whatever Caleb was building, it had the potential to make the next 48 hours very complicated for the arrangement Fletcher had spent 8 months constructing. He called the number Preston Holt had given him. Preston answered on the second ring. Fletcher described what he had seen, the trucks and the out-of-state plates and the lights on all night, and Della moving with a purpose that did not look like a family preparing to vacate. He suggested that whatever transaction Caleb was attempting to complete, it might be moving fast enough to slip through the window the bank's timeline had created. Preston thanked him. He made a second call, this one to a county health inspector he had worked with on 2 previous occasions, when a regulatory intervention had arrived at a convenient moment for certain property negotiations. He described an unsanctioned commercial food sale operation being conducted on an agricultural property, mentioned that the event appeared to be happening the following evening, and provided the county road address. Then he called his attorney and asked how solid the acceleration clause would hold up if challenged in court. His attorney said it would depend on the judge. Preston said that was not a satisfying answer. His attorney agreed and said the hour made it no more satisfying. That same evening, Della came in from checking the cooler temperatures and stood in the kitchen doorway without speaking. Caleb looked up from the loan documents spread across the table. She said, "Fletcher Briggs was on his back porch for 2 hours tonight with his phone. That is not unusual by itself. What is unusual is that his truck has been sitting at Preston Holt's branch parking lot twice in the last 8 months. I know because I drove past it both times and thought it was strange and said nothing because I did not want to say it out loud." Caleb looked at her. He thought about the 3-page botanical report. He thought about the soil survey and the consultant from San Marcos and the fact that Fletcher had walked the fence line last spring more times than usual and had not mentioned why. He thought about the Facebook post and the timing of it and the 20 minutes between the posting and whatever phone call had followed. He said nothing. He did not need to. He turned back to the documents and kept reading. Sunday arrived clear and windless. By 3 in the afternoon, the county road leading to the Mercer farm had more vehicles on it than it had seen since Caleb's father's funeral. There were black SUVs and town cars, and one burgundy Jaguar that Nate identified as belonging to the purchasing director of a Louisiana restaurant group that had been hunting for truffle alternatives since February. Raymond Cross arrived in the same black SUV as before, this time without the relaxed expression he had worn on Thursday. He found Nate near the entrance to the barn. "You told me this was exclusive," Cross said. "I told you we were discussing exclusivity," Nate said. The situation changed. Cross looked at the gathering crowd of suits and leather portfolios moving toward the Mercer barn. His jaw tightened. "What is the format?" he said. 10-pound lots. Opening bid $50,000 per lot. Certified funds only." Cross looked at the barn. He looked at the fields behind it, the dark red still visible in the long Texas evening light. He did the arithmetic the way men like him do arithmetic, without taking long about it. "Fine," he said. The coolers were arranged along the barn's interior wall, each one open and lit from above by the work lights Caleb had strung from the rafters that morning. The scarlet root was displayed in clear-sided containers packed in ice, the red stems vivid against the white, the sap still fresh at the cut points. Several of the buyers paused in the doorway when they entered and breathed in before they stepped forward. Caleb watched their faces change. It was the most honest thing he had seen in months. Nate stood on an overturned feed crate near the barn's center post and called the room to attention at 7 o'clock. Caleb stood near the back wall with his arms crossed and said nothing. Della stood beside him. She had changed into a clean blouse and pressed her jeans, which was the equivalent, for Della, of formal dress. She had her phone in her hand and a notepad on the barrel top beside her for recording bids. "Ladies and gentlemen," Nate said, "what you are standing in front of tonight is the only known commercial-scale supply of what we are calling scarlet root sorrel in the continental United States. The Commercial Food Lab certification is available for review at the front table. Flavor profile testing results are in the binder beside it. We are selling in 10-pound lots. Opening bid is $50,000 per lot. We have 8 lots available tonight." He paused. "If you need to confer with your kitchens or your financial officers, now is the time. We begin in 5 minutes." The room moved the way rooms move when serious money is about to change hands. People pulled out phones and stepped to the edges to make calls. Cross stood in the center with his hands in his pockets looking at the coolers. The Louisiana buyer, a woman in her 50s named Hargrove, who had not introduced herself to anyone and did not appear to feel the need, studied the certification binder with reading glasses produced from her jacket pocket. At 7:12, the barn doors opened and 2 men stepped in who had not been invited. One was a county health inspector in a polo shirt with a laminated badge. The other was a younger man in a county vehicle uniform carrying a clipboard and looking as though he would rather be somewhere else. The inspector scanned the room. He found Caleb near the back wall and walked toward him. "Sir, I have received a complaint regarding an unlicensed commercial food sale being conducted on this property. I'm going to need to see your temporary food establishment permit and your product handling certifications before this event can continue." The room went quiet. Caleb looked at the inspector. He didn't move from his position against the wall. Then he looked at Nate. Nate Gallagher was already unzipping the leather portfolio he had been carrying since he arrived. He removed a manila envelope and walked it to the inspector. "In that envelope," Nate said, "you will find the Commercial Food Lab certification for the product being sold tonight, classifying it as a naturally occurring oxalis variant safe for human consumption. You will also find a copy of the temporary food establishment permit issued by the county clerk's office Friday afternoon for a private agricultural product auction event at this address. And behind that you will find a letter from the county agricultural extension office confirming that the sale of raw, unprocessed plant material harvested from a registered agricultural property does not require a retail food license under Texas Health and Safety Code Section 431. The inspector opened the envelope. He read. He turned to the second page. He turned to the third. He looked up. He looked at the younger man with the clipboard. "We are done here," he said. They left the way they had come. The barn doors closed behind them. For a moment no one spoke. Then Raymond Cross, from the center of the room, said, "Can we get on with this?" Nate climbed back onto the feed crate. The bidding started at $50,000 and did not stay there long. Cross opened at $50 and the Louisiana buyer came in at $55 without hesitation. A buyer representing a Dallas group went to 60. Cross answered at 65. Hargrove went to 72. Someone near the barn door said 75, and Nate found the voice and confirmed the bid. Cross went to 80. He won the first lot at $83,000. The second lot opened at 60 and ran to 91, taken by a Houston group that had been quiet through the first round and then became very serious very quickly. The third lot went to Hargrove at 88. The fourth lot saw Cross and the Dallas group lock into an exchange that climbed to 97,000 before Cross stepped back, jaw set, and let it go. Della wrote every number down. By 9:45, the barn was empty of scarlet root. In its place, on the wooden table Caleb used for sorting equipment parts, sat a fireproof lockbox Nate had brought from Houston. Inside it were 8 certified bank drafts and 2 wire transfer confirmations. Della counted them against her notepad. She counted again. She looked up at Caleb. $914,000, she said. The barn was mostly empty now, the buyers moving back to their vehicles in the dark, engines starting on the county road. Raymond Cross was the last buyer to leave. He stopped near the barn door and turned back and looked at Caleb across the space where the coolers had been. "I want a first-right agreement for next season," Cross said. Caleb looked at him for a moment. "I will think about it," he said. Cross studied him the way men who are accustomed to getting what they want study people who decline to give it to them immediately. Then he nodded once, very slightly, and walked out into the Texas night. Della found Caleb at the equipment shed door an hour later, after the last vehicle had gone and the county road had gone quiet. He was standing in the dark opening of the shed, looking out at the south fields. The scarlet root was invisible in the darkness, but he knew it was there. 200 acres of it, root running 4 feet down into the hill country Kalish, indifferent to everything that had been resolved above the soil line. She came and stood beside him. They didn't speak for a while. Then she said, "What are you thinking about?" He said, "My grandfather." She nodded. She had known him long enough to know that this was not a deflection. It was the most precise answer he had. He took the green notebook from the shelf inside the shed door where he had left it Thursday morning. He held it in both hands in the dark and thought about Jonas Mercer writing by lamplight in 1951, watching a red plant grow after the flooding and trying to understand what it meant. Spending 12 years thinking it was a curse and 12 more years understanding what it was. He thought about Preston Holt. He thought about tomorrow morning. Tomorrow morning there was still a bank and still a debt, and still a man who had spent 8 months building a mechanism to take what did not belong to him. The auction had given Caleb what he needed to pay what he owed. It had not yet addressed the mechanism itself. It had not yet addressed Fletcher Briggs or the courier in September or the clause that did not exist in the original agreement. That was tomorrow. Tonight, Caleb stood in the dark opening of his equipment shed with his grandfather's notebook in his hands and $914,000 in a lockbox on a wooden table, and the scarlet root growing in the fields behind him the way it always had. He went inside. He sat at the kitchen table. Della put coffee in front of him without being asked. He opened the green notebook to the last page and read his grandfather's final words one more time. Not for information. He had the information. He read them the way you reread something when what you want is not the meaning but the voice behind it, the sound of a man who had figured something out and trusted that it would eventually matter. Then he closed the notebook and placed it on the table in front of him. He picked up his phone and called Dale. Dale answered on the second ring. Caleb said, "I need you at the bank when it opens tomorrow. Bring both copies of the original loan agreement, the one from 4 years ago and the one from September." Dale said, "I will be there at 9. Caleb said, "Thank you." He ended the call. He finished his coffee. He turned off the kitchen light. He went to bed and was asleep before midnight for the first time in 4 months. The deep, untroubled sleep of a man who knows exactly what he is going to do in the morning and is not afraid of it. Hill country mornings do not announce themselves with ceremony. The sun comes up indifferent to what happened the night before, burning through the cedar-scented dark without asking whether anyone below is ready for it. Caleb was already dressed when the light came, sitting at the kitchen table with both copies of the loan documents side by side, the original from 4 years ago and the renewal from September, reading them the way he should have read the second one the day a courier handed it to him at the tailgate. He read slowly and line by line, the way his grandfather had read weather and soil and the color of clouds building over the western ridge, looking for the thing that was different. He found it on page 2 of the September renewal. It was a single paragraph, set in the same font as the surrounding text, formatted to look like boilerplate. Section 7, subsection C, discovery of undisclosed high-value agricultural assets during the mitigation period shall constitute grounds for immediate acceleration of foreclosure proceedings at the discretion of the lending institution. The paragraph had no equivalent in the original agreement. It had no equivalent in any standard agricultural lending template Dale had been able to locate in 20 years of practice. It had been written for one purpose, and Caleb was sitting at his kitchen table looking directly at it. He set both documents in the manila envelope Dale had left with him. He put the green notebook on top. He drove to Kerrville with the windows down and the radio off. Dale was waiting outside the bank at 5 minutes to 9, holding a paper coffee cup and looking the way quiet men look when they have spent the weekend reviewing documents and arrived at conclusions they did not enjoy arriving at. He shook Caleb's hand. He looked at the envelope. "You found it," Dale said. "Section 7, subsection C," Caleb said. Dale nodded. He had found the same thing Saturday night and spent Sunday confirming what he suspected through 3 separate references in the Texas Agricultural Lending Standards published by the state's Department of Banking. The clause was not standard. It was not derived from any model lending agreement in common use. It bore the structural characteristics of language drafted by a private attorney for a specific institutional client, and its purpose was to create a legal mechanism to capture asset value that the lending institution had reason to believe existed before the borrower discovered it. "That is not creative banking practice," Dale had said on the phone Sunday night. "That is a predatory instrument, and if it was used on more than one borrower, which I suspect it was, then it becomes something that federal regulators have strong opinions about." They went in together. The branch was quiet at 9 on a Monday. 2 tellers behind the counter, a woman at a desk near the window working through paperwork. The receptionist looked up, and Dale gave his name and said they had business with the branch manager. Preston Holt came out of his office. He looked at Caleb first, and then at Dale, and then at the envelope under Caleb's arm. And something moved behind his eyes that was not quite surprise, but was the recognition of a man who has been watching a scenario develop and has just seen it arrive at the moment he was hoping would not come. He gestured toward his office. They sat. Dale placed his briefcase on the floor and opened it and removed his own copy of the 2 loan documents, paper-clipped and tabbed in 3 places. He set them on the mahogany desk between himself and Preston without preamble. "I'm here as Mr. Mercer's legal representative," Dale said. "We are prepared today to satisfy the outstanding debt in full, including the accelerated interest and early repayment penalties as calculated under the original loan terms. That total, as of this morning, is $387,000. We have a certified bank draft in that amount." He slid the draft across the desk. Preston did not pick it up. "The acceleration clause," he said, "has already been filed with the court. The hearing is set for tomorrow at 2, Dale said. "The acceleration clause is precisely what we need to discuss before we proceed to payment. Section 7, subsection C of the September renewal agreement. I would like you to direct me to the corresponding provision in the original loan agreement signed 4 years ago." There was a pause. "The original agreement predates the current mitigation terms," Preston said. "That is correct," Dale said. "It predates it because the clause does not exist in it. Section 7 of the original agreement concerns insurance requirements and contains no subsection C. The language in the renewal was added unilaterally without disclosure of the substantive change in terms to the borrower. Mr. Mercer was presented with this document as a routine administrative renewal. He was not advised to seek legal counsel before signing, and the material alteration of his legal exposure under the agreement was not explained to him in any form." Preston looked at this draft on his desk. Then he looked at Dale. "The renewal was presented in accordance with standard bank practice," he said. Dale opened his briefcase again and removed a second document. He placed it on the desk beside the first. "This is a written statement from Earl Donovan, formerly of this county, regarding the circumstances under which a materially similar acceleration clause was applied to his property 4 years ago by this branch. Mr. Donovan was also presented with a renewal document described as routine. He was also not advised of the substantive change in his legal exposure. He lost 240 acres as a result." He placed a third document on top. "This is a formal complaint filed this morning with the Farm Credit Administration in Washington." DATRC, and with the Texas Department of Banking, detailing the pattern of lending conduct at this branch as it relates to the use of non-standard acceleration clauses in agricultural mitigation agreements. Copies have been sent to both agencies by certified mail as of 8:15 this morning. Preston Holt sat very still. The morning light came through the plate glass window of his office and fell across the mahogany desk and across the certified bank draft and across the 2 loan documents and the statement from Earl Donovan and the formal complaint. And Preston looked at all of it the way a man looks at something he constructed carefully over a long period of time and has just watched come apart in a single sitting. "Mr. Holt," Dale said, "my client is prepared to pay the debt in full today, using the original loan terms as the operative agreement, and to consider the matter settled on those terms. What my client is not prepared to do is allow a non-standard contractual instrument, inserted without disclosure into a routine renewal, to stand as the basis for the seizure of a multi-generational agricultural property. If the bank accepts the payment and releases the lien, we will not pursue the complaint further at this time. If the bank declines, we will be in court tomorrow, and the subject of that hearing will not be foreclosure. It will be the conduct of this branch." Caleb had not spoken since they sat down. He had watched Preston's face the way he watched weather coming off the plateau, reading the pressure and the movement and the quality of light behind the eyes. He had watched the precise moment when Preston understood what this morning had actually brought him. It was not the moment Dale placed the 3rd document on the desk. It was the moment the 2 loan documents had been placed side by side. That was when Preston had known. Preston reached forward. He picked up the certified bank draft. He looked at it for a moment. Then he set it down and reached for his keyboard. "I will need to process this through our compliance officer," he said. His voice had changed. The quality of certainty that had lived in it on Saturday morning was gone from it now. It was a voice executing the mechanics of a situation, nothing more. "We will wait," Dale said. They waited 40 minutes. A woman from the compliance department came in and took the documents and went out again. Preston made 2 calls from his desk phone, keeping his voice low and his chair half-turned. Caleb sat and looked at the framed certificates on the wall behind Preston's desk, a business degree from a state university, a lending certification from a banking industry association, a photograph of Preston shaking hands with a man at an awards dinner, both of them wearing the particular smile of people who believe their trajectory has no ceiling. The compliance officer returned with a form. Preston signed it. He slid it across the desk to Dale, who read it and then slid it to Caleb. It was the release of lien, full satisfaction of debt, the foreclosure proceedings withdrawn, the acceleration clause rendered void by mutual agreement. Caleb signed at the bottom. He used the pen from his shirt pocket, the same cheap ballpoint he used to mark fence posts and fill out grain elevator tickets. He signed the way he did everything, without flourish, completely. Dale collected the documents. He clicked his briefcase latches closed. He stood and extended his hand to Preston, who shook it the way a man shakes hands when he has lost something he cannot recover. Caleb stood and looked at Preston for a moment and did not extend his hand. He said, "One thing before we go." Preston looked at him. "Earl Donovan," Caleb said, "you used the same mechanism on a 73-year-old man who had no lawyer and no leverage and no way to understand what was being done to him until it was already done. He lost 240 acres that his family had farmed for 2 generations. The complaint we filed this morning includes his name and his circumstances in full detail. I want you to understand that I am not doing that to protect myself. The debt is paid. My land is clear. I am doing it because Earl deserved someone to do it 4 years ago and no one did." Preston said nothing. Caleb walked out. The morning outside was bright and dry and smelled like cedar warming in the sun. Dale walked with him to the truck. They stood at the tailgate for a moment, which was where Caleb had stood in September when a courier had handed him a document on a clipboard, and he had trusted that a routine update was what it said it was. "You did what you needed to do," Dale said. Caleb nodded. He thanked Dale and paid him from the remaining funds in the lockbox, which he handed over in an envelope without counting because Della had counted it the night before and written the total on the outside. He drove home. Fletcher Briggs's property lay along the north fence line, 230 acres of improved pasture and dryland grain. The access road to Fletcher's operation ran along the shared fence for a quarter mile before curving north toward his equipment sheds, and Caleb slowed as he passed it without stopping. There was a conversation that needed to happen, but it was not today's conversation. Today had one job, and the job was finished. He pulled into his own driveway and sat in the truck for a moment. The south fields were ahead of him, the scarlet root still red and dense, undiminished by everything that had been resolved in the past 72 hours. The morning light hit the serrated leaves and turned them dark crimson at the edges and deep amber at the centers, and the whole expanse moved in the early breeze, a slow undulation like something at rest. His grandfather had looked at this same plant and spent 12 years calling it a curse before he understood what it was. Caleb had made it to 4 months before the understanding arrived, and even then it had taken a burn barrel and a sleepless night and a stranger at a farmer's market who had been searching for exactly the thing Caleb was trying to destroy. He suspected Jonas would have found this neither surprising nor particularly instructive. Understanding arrives when it arrives. The land does not adjust its schedule. Della came out to the truck. She opened the passenger door and sat sideways on the seat with her feet on the running board, the way she had always done when she wanted to talk and he was still in the truck. "It is done," she said. "It is done," he said. She nodded. She looked at the fields. She was quiet for a moment. "Raymond Cross called this morning," she said. "He wants to discuss a first-right agreement for next season. He is prepared to offer a guaranteed minimum purchase volume." "What did you tell him?" "I told him we would think about it." Caleb looked at his wife. She had a particular expression she wore when she had already made a decision and was waiting to see if he would arrive at the same one on his own. "We should not sell exclusive," he said. She nodded. "Not to Cross and not to any single buyer. We hold the auction format every season, keep every buyer competing against every other buyer." That was exactly what she had decided. He knew that. She let him say it anyway. "There is one more thing," she said. She produced a folded piece of paper from the pocket of her jeans. "The food science department at Texas A&M. A professor there reached out to Nate last week after seeing the lab certification. He wants to study the plant, the soil interaction specifically. He says the flavor compound the root system is producing is something his department has not encountered in a naturally occurring species before." "What does he want from us?" Caleb read the letter. It was 2 pages, dense with technical language he followed only partially, but the essential request was clear. A research partnership. The university would conduct a full analysis of the soil chemistry and the plant biology at no cost to the farm. In exchange, the Mercer property would be identified in the published research as the source location, which Caleb understood would create a provenance story that would add considerably to the commercial value of the scarlet root over time. He folded the letter and put it in his shirt pocket. "I will think about it," he said. Della stepped down from the running board. She put her hand briefly on his arm, the same gesture she had made the night of the bank notice, the same weight behind it. Then she went back inside. Caleb sat for a moment longer. Then he got out of the truck and walked to the equipment shed. The green notebook was on the shelf inside the door where he had left it the night before. He picked it up and walked out to the edge of the south field, to the same place he had stood the evening he burned the first barrel full of scarlet root. The place where the smell had changed and everything had started to change with it. He held the notebook in both hands and did not open it. He had read it enough times now that the words were in him, the way certain things get into a man over time. Not something he reaches for, but something he operates from without thinking about it. The land that raised this family has one more thing to give. Wait for the right moment, then hold on. Later that afternoon, Nate drove out from Austin. He sat at the kitchen table with Caleb and Della and a yellow notepad, and they talked for 3 hours about what the next season could look like approached as a business rather than as a response to a crisis. Nate had projections on pricing based on the auction results and on the truffle market in Europe and on the trajectory of high-end restaurant sourcing in the American South and Southwest, which was moving steadily toward regional ingredients in a way that created an advantage for a hill country farm with a product that could not be replicated anywhere else. The numbers were significant. They were not the kind of numbers that changed who Caleb Mercer was. What he had ambitions toward was the continued operation of the Mercer farm in the manner that 3 generations of his family had operated it, which meant the land taken care of and the debt managed and enough margin to survive the seasons that went wrong. Because some seasons always go wrong, and the only protection against them is what the good seasons build. At the end of the 3 hours, Nate closed his notepad and looked at Caleb. "There is one more thing I've been trying to find the right moment to tell you," he said. "The food science journal that published the original description of the plant, the one from 2019 that I tracked for 3 years before I found you at that market. The researcher who wrote it listed his sources in the acknowledgement section. He thanked a farmer in Kendall County, Texas, who had allowed him to take samples from his property during a research trip in 1986. The farmer's name in the acknowledgement was Jonas R. Mercer. Caleb sat very still. "Your grandfather," Nate said. He knew what he had. He let a researcher document it. He just never knew what became of the research, and the researcher never tracked down the source again. The samples sat in a university archive for over 2 decades before the researcher returned to them as part of a broader study on regional soil-plant interactions. The paper took that long because no one had known to look for it sooner. The trail went cold. Until you showed up at a farmer's market in Austin with a trash bag full of the most interesting plant I have ever put in my mouth. Caleb looked at the green notebook on the table beside him. He thought about Jonas Mercer in 1986 walking a researcher across the South Draws, showing him the red plant, letting him take his samples, going back to his work afterward without ceremony. He thought about the researcher writing a paper 23 years later that a young ingredient scout found in a journal and spent 3 more years trying to trace back to its source. He thought about the unhurried patience of things that take longer than one person's lifetime to complete themselves. He picked up the notebook. He held it for a moment. Then he set it back down. He said, "My grandfather was a man who did his work and trusted that it would eventually matter. I do not know that he expected to be proven right in quite this specific a way." Nate smiled. Della refilled the coffee cups without being asked. Outside the kitchen window, the south fields held their color as the afternoon light shifted from white to gold to the deep amber that comes to hill country in the last hour before dark. The scarlet root moved in the evening breeze, thick and undiminished, the same plant it had always been, asking nothing and yielding everything, the same way it had moved through every season since it first came up through the wet soil after the 1949 flooding, the same way it had moved when Jonas watched it and wrote about it by lamplight, the same way it would move after Caleb was gone and whoever came after him walked these draws trying to understand what they had been given. Some evenings Dale called with updates on the federal inquiry. It was proceeding the way these things proceed, with the particular friction of institutions examining themselves from the inside. Earl Donovan had been contacted by an investigator in October and had given a recorded statement. 2 other former clients of the branch had come forward after the complaint entered the public record. Preston Holt had been placed on administrative leave pending the outcome of the review. The process moved at its own pace and could not be hurried. Caleb did not spend time thinking about Preston Holt. He spent time thinking about the harvest schedule for the second cutting and the cooler capacity they would need if auction volume increased next season, and the research proposal from Texas A&M, which he eventually signed on a Wednesday afternoon in November, sitting at the kitchen table with a pot of coffee and Dale on the phone to review the terms. He signed with the same cheap ballpoint he used for everything. In March of the following year, Fletcher Briggs listed his 230 acres with a real estate broker in Kerrville. Caleb saw the sign from the county road on a morning he was driving out for feed. He slowed down. He read the sign. He drove past without stopping. Some things resolved themselves. The fence line between their properties remained exactly where it had always been, and the scarlet root grew on the Mercer side of it and didn't cross, which was the kind of outcome that requires no decision from anyone. On a morning in late October, when the heat had finally given way to the dry, clear cool that hill country waits all summer for, Caleb walked the south draws alone before breakfast. The scarlet root had been harvested twice more since the auction and had come back both times with the same deep stubbornness that had defeated 3 rounds of herbicide in the spring. The root system drove down. The stems came up. The amber sap collected at the base of each leaf in the early morning cool and caught the light in a way that was almost metallic. He walked to the center of the field and stopped. He crouched down, the way Raymond Cross had crouched on that first Thursday, getting close enough to see a single plant for what it actually was rather than what it had been assumed to be. He looked at it for a long time. Then he stood up. He walked back to the house. Della had eggs on the stove and coffee poured. He sat down at the kitchen table and set the green notebook in front of him and did not open it. He had read it enough times now that the words were in him, the way certain things get into a man over time. Not something he thinks about, but something he simply is. The land that raised this family has one more thing to give. It had given it. It was giving it still. It would keep giving it for longer than Caleb would be around to receive it. And that was not a sad thought. That was the whole point of land. That was what the Mercers had understood for 3 generations, and what Preston Holt, with his fitted suit and his contractual mechanisms and his 8 months of careful preparation, had never understood at all. Land is not an asset to be acquired and liquidated. It is an argument being made across time. And you have to be willing to wait long enough to hear the whole thing. Caleb picked up his coffee. He looked out the window at the south fields in the October morning light. He had 80 acres left to harvest before the first frost. He finished his breakfast and went to work.